Hey, all CHP listeners around the world. Welcome back to the China History Podcast. Laszlo Montgomery here, finally talking about something else other than Taiwan. Man, that was a long series. Those of you from Seattle who saw the title of this episode probably knew about him already or were familiar with his name. And others who study Chinese American history perhaps know of Qing Hee. Some of you who listened to my CHP 194 episode from years ago covering the history of Toisan immigration to the U.S. might recall I spoke about him for about a minute or so. But if the name doesn't ring a bell, you came to the right place. This time around, we're going to do a much deeper dive on the life and times of Qing Hee. In Mandarin, his name was Chen Yi. I checked with a couple Toisan friends of mine who gave me conflicting versions of the correct way to pronounce Chen's name in Toisan. It's spelled Gee Hee, Geehee. So I consulted the Oracle at ChatGPT, and it gave me a very authoritative-sounding response that boiled down to Qing Hee. So let's go with that. I'd call him by his Mandarin name, Chen Yi, but considering he wasn't a northerner and I'm guessing didn't speak anything other than Toisan in English, let's just continue on with Qing Hee. First of all, what's nice about Qing Hee's story is that it doesn't have much of anything to do with the usual suspects from Chinese American history that, tends to lean heavily in favor of the communities in San Francisco, LA, Chicago, and New York. With Qin's story, we can also gain some insight into the bigger picture of Chinese American history in America's spectacular Cascadia region in the northwest of the country. Qing Hee was born June 22, 1844, in a village close to Toisan in the heart of Taishan, about an hour drive south of Jiangmen. This was during the Daoguang era, 2 years into the treaty port years, so Qin got to live his entire life during China's so-called century of humiliation. He came from a poor Taishan family, but through a simple twist of fate, he got himself noticed by a fellow Toisan local who brought the almost 20-year-old Qing Hee with him to America in 1862 or 63. For the first 6 years, Qin tried a number of ventures. Like most Toisanese in his shoes, he went into the gold extraction business, and not finding success in that, he lived a nomadic life, traveling the West Coast and taking work wherever he could get it. After the signing of the Burlingame Treaty that established relations with China, Qin moved up to Port Gamble, Washington, and worked in a lumber mill in North Kitsap County. Thanks to a kind soul he got to know up there, he learned English and American customs. An 1870 census counted 33 Chinese in all of King County and 234 in the Washington Territory. With the free flow of movement between people from China and the U.S., it was a huge gift to the capitalist class who were able to get in on some of the infrastructure action in China and enjoy the benefits of Chinese workers on these shores. The working class, who had to compete with the Chinese for those jobs or who just downright didn't like them because they were Asian, well, they had nothing but disdain for this Burlingame Treaty, and the same went for the capitalist class who so willingly used imported labor to squeeze their wages and force them into accepting lower pay packets. Qin met Henry Yesler, a major figure in Washington state history who made his fortune in the lumber business. He's considered to be one of the founders of the city of Seattle. Yesler saw something in Qin and was able to convince him that Seattle was the future, and to try his luck up there. And during his period in Port Gamble, Qin got to befriend the family of Chief Seattle, and he also worked with and got to know many of the Squamish and Duwamish people up there. And Qing Hee was one of the earliest Chinese to call Seattle home, but he wasn't the first. The first Chinese resident in Seattle was listed as one Ah Long, who in 1850 was employed by a U.S. Army outpost as a domestic servant. And 62 years earlier, in May 1788, late Qianlong period, roughly 4 dozen Chinese serving aboard 2 British trading vessels landed in Nootka Sound, west coast of Vancouver Island. And they stayed till September, trapped as many otter pelts as they could, and left. And if anyone from China visited this part of the world earlier than that, history didn't record who they were. When Chinese first began arriving in bigger numbers in Seattle, they were segregated from the local residents there. The Native Americans, too. They had to keep south of Mill Street in a district known as the Sawdust. Mill Street is today's Yesler Way in Seattle. That's where Yesler had his lumber mill. In 1873, upon Yesler's urging, Qin moved to Seattle. There in Seattle, he met fellow Hoisanese Cheng Xue, also known in American history books as Qin Chun Hock, or Qin Ching Hock. He's called Seattle's first Chinese. He arrived as a teenager in 1860 and worked as a domestic servant in someone's home, and later for Henry Yesler at his mill. And he saved up, and in 1868, founded Hua Chong, a dry goods store. It's called the first Chinese-owned company in Seattle. And Qin Chun Hock grew rich on China trade and from supplying general merchandise to the domestic Chinese market. He also ran a budding labor contracting business, and he took on Qing Hee as a junior partner in his Hua Chong company. And as the business grew, they sunk those profits into real estate. 1875, Qing Hee and wife had their first son, Chen Lin. Much earlier, Qin had arranged for a wife who later joined him in Seattle. And their boy, Chen Lin, was the first known Chinese born in the Washington Territory. The territory didn't become a state till 1889, becoming the nation's 42nd state. You had to start somewhere, and today there's around 166,000 ethnic Chinese in Seattle. But back in 1876, there were only about 250 Chinese in Seattle and another 300-400 passing through town, staying a while, and then moving on. Qin Chun Hock hired Qing Hee to manage his labor brokering business while he mainly focused on trading and retail sales. Perfect timing for Qing Hee because the following year, direct steamship routes had been established between Seattle and southern China. And this made things much easier for Qin to enjoy more efficient access to Hoisanese labor. He could get them right off the farm in Toisan and bring them directly to Seattle, where, in those halcyon days, demand was still strong and Chinese exclusion still years away. With the completion of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific railroads, a lot of workers had to find gainful employment elsewhere. Qing Hee had agents down in California who sent the workers north to help build the next great wave of rail lines joining the northern parts of the country together, with the Northern Pacific Railway being the most ambitious of these rail lines. Back in 1874, when work began on the Seattle Walla Walla Railroad, the supply of strapping bodies looking for work exceeded the demand of workers needed, and someone had written in the Puget Sound Dispatch, quote, "It is hoped that the management of the Seattle to Walla Walla Railroad Company will from the very start adopt the rule of employing only American or European labor," end quote. As work began on the Northern Pacific Railway that ran from the Great Lakes region in Minnesota all the way to the Puget Sound, Hua Chong became the main supplier of Chinese labor. They were one-stop shopping for any organization's labor needs. Miners, demolition experts, railroad workers, farm workers, domestic helpers, graders who flattened out hills that made it easier to build cities on. All of these muscle jobs were highly in demand. And for those businesses who preferred Chinese labor, Hua Chong was the ZipRecruiter of its day. Their eternal foe were the noble and holy order of the Knights of Labor, champions of the 8-hour work week, ending child labor, giving the working people their due. Their organization was open to all people as long as they weren't Asian. The Knights of Labor were the first of their kind. These railroad bosses and other large employers used the Chinese as a lever to squeeze their European American workers and Knights of Labor members. Like other American employers and industrialists, these captains of industry had a strong dislike for the Knights of Labor for having the audacity to demand fair treatment and a decent wage. And by playing one race off against the other, deliberately or not, it did plenty to stoke anti-Chinese sentiments. The Rock Springs Massacre of September 2nd, 1885 was an indirect result of this game played between the capitalist and working classes. 28 Chinese miners killed, 15 injured, and 78 homes torched. The Knights of Labor had set up a chapter in Rock Springs in 1883. The massacre was never pinned on them, but there were plenty Knights of Labor men among the rioters. The U.S. Army had to be called in to restore order, and the newspapers, a year into Chinese exclusion, couldn't heap enough blame and contempt on the Chinese for causing all this to happen. The Rock Springs Massacre ended up inspiring similar actions elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest. 5 days after the bloody events in Rock Springs, Wyoming, there was another massacre of Chinese workers in Squaw Valley near Issaquah and other parts of East Seattle. The 1882 Chinese exclusion law obviously wasn't good for Watchung's labor supply business. Thanks to the efforts of Qing Hee and the Watchung organization, the Northern Pacific Railroad was employing about 15,000 Chinese workers just in the Washington Territory, and there were another 6,000 to the east in Idaho and Montana. With Chinese leaving in droves and no fresh supply of workers from Toisan to provide any replenishment, Qing Hee had to pivot and get into the business of providing workers with forged documents to get around the restrictions. Other services they offered included creating new identities and coaching prospective workers about how to navigate the immigration gateways. After the 1882 exclusion law went into effect, Qing Hee looked up to the north, to Canada, just on the other side of the border. The Canadian government didn't hop on the Chinese exclusion bandwagon until 1885, and even so, they merely established a $50 head tax on the Chinese. This was not so difficult to get around. So for a while, anyway, all the Chinese workers had to do was get from Toisan to British Columbia. And once they made it to the shores of this great land of maple syrup, Qing Hee's organization would sneak them across the border into the United States and direct them to their assigned workplace. No border walls, no drones, a wilderness landscape. Sneaking human beings across the U.S.-Canadian border wasn't as difficult as it is now. Local Vancouver residents suddenly, in 1882, 1883, started seeing an unusually high number of Chinese suddenly appearing on the streets. And snakeheads back then, well, they didn't have the technologies of today's traffickers, but the business model of moving people around clandestinely was still pretty much the same at its simplest level. So Qin and his Watchung organization was in the thick of that business. But in 1883, the Northern Pacific Railroad was completed, and Chinese and other laborers who built that line, again, needed to find new employment. With such a large influx of workers to the labor supply, the same thing that always happened again, and matters finally boiled over in 1885. When we look back on those Chinese exclusion years and the decade leading up to them, Dennis Kearney is most often remembered and held up as the figurehead of the West Coast anti-Chinese movement, with his working man's party, his provocative and racist speeches, and the Chinese must go. Well, in Seattle, their Dennis Kearney was a man named Daniel Cronin, and one of his closest colleagues was a woman named Mary Kenworthy. Dan was a Knights of Labor organizer who took it upon himself to do a little additional organizing in Seattle to expel the city's Chinese, or Mongolians, as they liked to call them back then. Dan Cronin had a little previous experience, having organized against Chinese miners in Eureka, California, at the top of the state. And when he rolled into town and correctly read the mood of the people in Washington, he knew this wasn't going to be too difficult to achieve his ends. And he assembled 9 like-minded conspirators, and in 1885 began plotting to expel the Chinese. Cronin set up an anti-Chinese Congress that was made up of leaders of the many unions who represented the workers. The mayor of Tacoma was elected as head of the Congress. And after having one of their rallies on October 24th, 1885, they decided the Chinese of Tacoma, Washington had to go. And they had until November 1st to clear out of town and take up residence elsewhere. You might say the good people of Tacoma, who shared anti-Chinese sentiments, who resented simply the whole idea of them being there, well, they got the ball rolling. It was a long time coming. Those organizing and speaking out against allowing the Chinese to reside in Tacoma spent months fighting City Hall, stamping their feet and hollering and making some uncompromising demands to expel the Chinese from Tacoma. It was now 3 years into Chinese exclusion, and no small number of people looked at the 1882 law and considered it as a kind of blank check to lash out at the Chinese. On November 3rd, 1885, Knights of Labor-led groups backed up their talk with action. They were pretty much the self-appointed and acknowledged leaders of the working-class people and of this effort to expel the Chinese. And that morning, they descended on Chinatown and pounded on the doors of all Chinese residences and businesses and told the terrified residents to show up at the corner of 7th and Pacific at a certain time. This is where the old Tacoma City Hall and clock tower is located. And they did it. They expelled the Chinese from Tacoma. Back then, about 10% of the population. Got them all on trains heading south, where they ended up in Portland. And whatever happened to this lost first Chinese community of Tacoma, I don't know. And it took about 35 years for the Chinese to return to Tacoma in any numbers and reestablish the community. And after the Chinese had been expelled, the folks who drove them out went back into town and burned the dwellings where the Chinese lived together. And the ones responsible for instigating and directing the whole expulsion of Tacoma's Chinese residents, who pushed law and order to the side and directed the angry mob on that day, these were the so-called Tacoma 27. Well, they were charged for their crimes and had to show up in court, but you can be sure if Vincent Chin couldn't get justice in 1984, you can imagine how the case went against the organizers of this November 1885 Chinese expulsion from Tacoma. And this pretty much capped off an absolutely horrific year for Chinese in the Pacific Northwest, especially if you include western Wyoming. There was a lot of blood shed by Toisanese and Cantonese natives who tried their luck in the Pacific Northwest. We remember a lot of the largest atrocities committed against them in the hills and mountains. It was probably a lot worse than we'll ever know. Chinese exclusion continued on 58 more years until 1943, but 1885 saw perhaps the worst of this law, later condemned by the U.S. Congress in 2011 and 2012, along with expressions of regret. And for those unfamiliar with the state of Washington, Tacoma, like I said, is right next door to Seattle, just to the south. And when fellow like-minded people up in Seattle heard about what happened in Tacoma, it gave them some ideas. The press had heralded this expulsion of Chinese from Tacoma as, quote, the Tacoma Method, which essentially involved gathering a mob, descending on the Chinese, and frog-marching them out of town. Then you just burn down their district and call it a job well done. Early 1886, were not good times, but you have to hand it to Daniel Cronin. He was able to turn that pent-up anger and resentment of the working-class people of Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland, and he used this common thread of anti-Chinese feelings to galvanize the working-class folk into a political force. The Chinese were not alone, though. Standing on the side of the Chinese of Seattle were the merchant class, the city fathers, elites, and capitalists of all stripes. They were able to put up a good fight to maintain the status quo and to push back against Cronin. But in a democracy, numbers matter. Dan Cronin had the numbers and perfect timing on his side. during hardscrabble times, what's easier to ignite than a class war, a race war, or both? He was able to use the political process to get his people elected. And so high did the heat get turned up after what happened in Tacoma, Grover Cleveland, in the first year of his first term, had to send federal troops to keep things under control. And this very idea of federal intervention in a local matter just infuriated the Knights of Labor and those allied with them. Aside from their seething hatred of the Chinese, those aligned with Dan Cronin also had an intense dislike for those in society who supported the Chinese or did business with them, shopped at their stores, and didn't revile them, and were even friendly with them. And this group fought tooth and nail both in support of the Chinese residents of Seattle as well as against those actions being called for by Daniel Cronin, Mary Kenworthy, and the leaders in their political movement. As long as they had the political upper hand, the voices of tolerance and inclusion were able to maintain the status quo and remain true to the ideals symbolized in the Statue of Liberty that would be dedicated in October of that very year of 1886. But with Cronin and Kenworthy's organizing and by tapping into this popular anti-Chinese sentiment that was wafting all over the Pacific Northwest, among not only men but women as well, they were able to win control of the local government with their People's Party. They didn't hold on to power for long, but long enough to indelibly ink their names to the Seattle riots of February 6 to 9, 1886. When they won control of the city government, they passed one ordinance after another directed at the Chinese, including one that said every person had to have 512 cubic feet of space. And they called it the Cubic Ear Ordinance. Everyone was entitled to a space of at least 8 by 8 by 8 feet. And they knew the Chinese living along the Seattle waterfront wouldn't be able to comply with this. So I think you get the picture. These laws were meant to harass the Chinese. The hostility and rhetoric between the two sides that had been going at a rolling boil for more than 2 months since the expulsion from Tacoma got so bad and so toxic had the scorn for each other become. The leaders of the workers released a statement that said, quote, "We, in common with all good citizens, shall treat all such pro-Chinese people with the contempt and scorn which they rightly deserve, and we shall regard them so far the enemies of good order, of society, and free American citizenship as to be unworthy of recognition, or of any social or business intercourse, and shall also treat those who shall countenance or in any manner uphold them," meaning the Chinese, "as of the same character." End quote. And wait, didn't stop there. Equal invective was also reserved for all of the fence-sitters who didn't publicly line up with either side. They too were guilty of sympathizing with the Chinese. The working-class radicalism was very much us or them in 1886. You had to pick a side. And even though President Cleveland was kind enough to send federal troops back in November 1885 to maintain order there, he was no friend of the Chinese either. When it came time to sign the Scott Act on October 1st, 1888, he couldn't grab his pen fast enough to sign it and put that bill into law. As you recall from a couple previous CHP episodes, the Scott Act was the exclusion law that specifically addressed Chinese who left the United States intending to return. This was the law that prevented them from getting back in. For several months leading up to the actual Seattle riots, this ugly scene played out until the morning of February 7th, 1886. Seattle's Chinese residents had to face that unimaginable terror that most of us will never know of being targeted by a hateful mob. It was a very well-executed operation. Everyone was split up into small groups and each with a specific assignment or doors to break down, and all the Chinese were rounded up and led south, away from Seattle. And as they were forcibly marched southward by the assembled mob, they carried with them whatever they could, and after being led to somewhere on the waterfront, they were herded onto a boat that was going to take them to San Francisco, where they could be the problem of that city government. An old trick. Governor DeSantis, he used it last year with those Venezuelan asylum seekers. He sent them from Miami to Martha's Vineyard. So he wasn't the first one to do that. Many Chinese in 1884 and 85, seeing how precarious things were getting in Seattle and Tacoma, had already left the scene, electing not to face what these remaining 350 or so fellow Chinese were now facing. Only 97 Chinese were able to get on that boat, and that left 253 all dressed up with no place to go, and the scene got uglier as these remaining Chinese were led back to the city, protected by federal troops, but still facing a jeering and very belligerent crowd. And a judge had demanded everyone show up in his courtroom the following morning to deal with this. So the next morning, a somewhat amicable agreement was worked out by the judge that allowed for a peaceful and orderly expulsion of the Chinese from Seattle. But the temperature of the mood by then was too hot. Even with armed federal troops, the mob still made attempts to charge them and to get at the Chinese who the federales were protecting. Blood was shed, and martial law was quickly declared. The Chinese knew they weren't wanted in Seattle, and their lives were in danger if they stayed. So after 20 years of trying to establish a beachhead in Seattle, the Chinese began to leave. They'll return come the 1930s. That's a story for another day, perhaps. And that concerns the tale of Mr. Ran Chia, better known as Gun Dip. Upon Qing Hee's departure from Seattle, it will be Gun Dip who will become the most prominent Chinese in the Pacific Northwest. Japanese workers, not subject to the Exclusion Act, would end up filling the vacuum created by Chinese who had left the region for other locations. And riding this storm out throughout the 1870s, 80s, and into the 20th century was Qing Hee. As I said, he had arrived in Seattle back in 1873, so when all this terrible stuff was happening in Tacoma and Seattle, he was right in the middle of it. Like other Chinese-American heroes from this time in history, he spoke fluent English and was quite familiar with American ways and the American system of justice. So he wasn't in the same boat as those Chinese who hadn't been there that long and were caught up in this moment. When it reached a certain level, Qing Hee had telegraphed the China Consul General down in San Francisco and sent out an SOS. And thanks to the assistance of the consulate, many of Seattle's residents who ended up losing property and other assets were later compensated for damages. When Cleveland sent federal troops following the expulsion of the Chinese from Tacoma, it had been Qing Hee who had telegraphed the Chinese consulate in San Francisco with this desperate plea. Chinese residents of Tacoma forcibly driven out yesterday. From 200 to 300 Chinese now in Seattle, imminent danger. Local authorities willing but not strong enough to protect us. We ask you to secure protection for us. End quote. So Qing Hee, with all his connections in Seattle, he did all he could to protect his fellow Chinese, who for the most part all came from his little corner of China on the western side of the Pearl River Delta region. Around 1888 or 89, Qing Hee split from Hua Chong and registered his own company called Guangduck. And his core business was the same one it had been since he had arrived in Seattle, and this was supplying labor to everyone in the Pacific Northwest who was building a railroad, grading land for infrastructure projects, logging, picking fruit, cleaning houses, or extracting minerals from the earth. Skilled, unskilled, didn't matter. $1 a day per worker. Chin would get the workers all kitted up at his store and gave them a place to flop upstairs for a few days before heading on to their assigned place of work. And Hua Chong handled their payroll, provided overseers to manage the work gangs, and adjudicated on whatever problems the employer had with his workers, or vice versa. And Chin was also given the agency for passenger tickets on the Northern Pacific Rail and steamship lines. And he set himself up in the Canton Building, which was better known as the Qing Hee Building, 208 to 210 South Washington Street, the first brick building in Seattle. And he ran his empire from that location. The exclusion laws, though there was some wiggle room, did eventually dry up the supply of Chinese workers in Washington. Canadian and American border officials did get wise and were able to put a crimp in that supply chain. And by 1900, there were maybe 4,000 Chinese in the whole state of Washington. So with this labor contracting gravy train reaching the end of the line, Qin tried to pivot to U.S.-China trade. And in addition to engaging in trade, Qin also began leveraging all his connections and expertise to become a middleman of sorts, putting deals together between American investors and empire builders looking to score big in China. His most blue-chip colleague was James J. Hill, builder of the Northern Pacific Railway. Qin Hee became Hill's man in Asia, and Qin's company, Guangduc, opened up offices in China, Hong Kong, and Japan. And this is what pulled him over to China in 1904. Before he left for Toisan in 1904-1905, Qin Hee passed the business on to his son, Qin Lem. And after enjoying front row seats for so many decades in America's Northwest and getting a taste of the magnitude of global commerce and all the possibilities that went hand in hand with improved logistics, Qin Hee came up with the noble and patriotic idea to build his own railroad and to achieve in China what all these railroad barons had done in the United States. And this wasn't just some pie-in-the-sky idea. Qin Hee knew this business from every angle, and his grand plan was to lay down the necessary tracks in his bucolic portion of the Pearl River Delta and establish a regional rail network that would ultimately link up to other lines that would put his ancestral home of Toisan or Taishan on the grid, so to speak. So by linking up with one of the main trunk lines, he would be remembered as the native son of Toisan who brought modernity and prosperity to his fellow villagers and townsfolk. Well, that was the dream anyway. It was to be the first railway financed solely with Chinese money. During this final decade of the Qing Dynasty, there wasn't enough going on in Taishan to justify a railroad. The greatness of this region, besides its agricultural value, was in its people, who went out and helped build cities and economies of whole nations. So like Kevin Costner's character in Field of Dreams, Qin Hee believed if he just built it, they would come. His partner in this venture, known as the Sun Ning Railway or新宁铁路, was named Yu Zhuo or Yu Zhuk. These two pooled their resources, expertise, and network of overseas Chinese investors to build this railroad. Qin went to the overseas Chinese in the Pacific Northwest, as well as the two tried-and-true reservoirs of investment capital in Hong Kong and Singapore. And they were able to raise $2.75 million. Yu Zhuk had his own investors to turn to, and the company was formally registered in 1906, and they got the first 15 miles of track laid and opened the line in January 1908. And into 1909, and for the next 5 years, the Sun Ning Railway grew little by little, reaching the western Pearl River Delta regional hub of Jiangmen in 1913. By then, the Qing Dynasty had fallen, and no one knew how everything was going to shake out yet. Everyone thought things would finally settle down in 1916 when Yuan Shikai took control of the government, but that ended up being only the beginning of more pain and suffering for China. Obtaining financing was a constant source of stress for Qin Hee. From the moment the ink was dry on the company charter, Qin was forced to spend more time than he anticipated fighting fires, dealing with the lawlessness and lack of any central authority, warlords, landlords, all the greatest hits of those times. What should have taken a week took months and made a mockery of his planning and budgeting. And as the 1920s dawned, Qin Hee's Sun Ning Railway was still growing, getting closer to Guangzhou. And if his Sun Ning Railway could only reach the city of Foshan, which already had access to Guangzhou, then he'd finally reach his goal of being able to connect Taishan with the rest of the country via the railway network. And he also wanted to extend the railroad line all the way west to where Zhanjiang is on the Leizhou Peninsula, thereby creating an east-to-west line that ran along the southern portion of Guangdong province. So many hopes and dreams Qing Hee had for this railway, but he was lucky to get as much built as he did. The uncertain times, the lack of funding, the rush by others to build competing rail lines, everything worked against him. And by 1926, with tracks still not laid due to financing and other problems, the local warlord government just came in and took it over, and it was never able to be extended to any major port or rail trunk line that would have allowed Qing Hee to realize his dream of bringing future prosperity to his hometown of Taishan. After running the operation into the ground, the government returned management of the Sun Ning Railway to corporate control. But as the days grew closer to July 1937 and the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the viability of the Sun Ning Railway further deteriorated. After Japan invaded China and worked their way southward towards Guangzhou, in 1938, the whole railroad was disassembled, and whatever couldn't be transported west to be used in other rail projects was either destroyed or abandoned to the Japanese, who snatched it as soon as they took over Taishan. Had he lived long enough to see this happen, it would have killed him. But by the end of June 1929, Qing Hee died in his home village of Doushan Langmei in Taishan. And after being beaten down by all this bad fortune and the capriciousness of the times, Qing Hee had to admit defeat. He had the misfortune to have been born 100 years too early. His life ends quite abruptly, and there's very little detail other than to say he retired to his village and died there. And one account I read said he died in Seattle. Since he began work on the Sun Ning Railway in 1904-05, he had made frequent trips back and forth to the U.S. He lived to 85, got to give him credit for that, but it's heart-wrenching when you think about a man his age, even in his 70s, after all he had achieved in America and all that he went through running the whole awful gauntlet of Chinese exclusion, to return to his hometown with his Taishan dream and take all that he had learned in America and put it to use in China. But this pioneer of early Chinese-American history in the Pacific Northwest, this veteran of the Seattle riots of February 1886 and all the anti-Chinese racist laws and ordinances passed one after the other, meant to break his spirit. In the end, it was his own homeland where he'd face his final disappointment. He's remembered for his patriotism and loyalty to his hometown of Toisan. There's a monument in his honor there, just as we have our early Chinese-American heroes of Los Angeles. Qing Hee is part of Seattle's early history, when the city was at the earliest stages of its growth. Okay, this is Laszlo Montgomery, thankful as I've ever been that you listened all the way to the end. Rest assured, a splendid time is guaranteed for all, so please consider coming back next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.